Hello, everybody. My name is Skylar, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar hosted by Influicity. Today's webinar is all about podcast hosting and choosing the best host for your podcast. I'm going to take any questions that you might have at the end, so you can just feel free to pop them into your chat box or into the webinar's Q&A tab at any time while we're going through here. Let's get started. There we go. When you're planning on launching a podcast for your brand, you have a lot of decisions to make. What subject matter are you going to cover? What about your show's concept makes it different from every other podcast on the airwaves right now? What hosting sites are you using? What your format and posting frequency is going to be, and on and on and on. In the grand scheme of all of these decisions, deciding who your host should be seems like a relatively small leap. Many companies simply choose an internal employee with some expertise in their subject matter, while others decide to hire well-known influencers to host their show. The reality is that this decision is much more important than most people make it out to be. Your host is the central driving force behind your entire podcast, and their presence can mean the difference between a show that fades into obscurity and a show that rockets to the top of the charts. Today, we're going to talk about how your host affects your podcast performance, what qualities a host needs to have in order to create a successful podcast, and the screening methods that we use to pick the perfect host for every custom podcast we create. To put it simply, your host is your podcast. You can write all of the scripts and edit your episodes as much as you like, but at the end of the day, your host is the very essence that makes your podcast unique and keeps your listeners engaged. Your host is the vehicle through which your content reaches your listeners. And in this case, the packaging is almost more important than the product itself. A recent survey showed that an astonishing 83% of podcast listeners described feeling like the hosts of their favorite podcasts were friends. They felt a deep connection to these hosts, their anecdotes, and the details of their lives. And while this feeling doesn't extend to all genres or all fan bases, the point still stands. Podcast listeners want to feel connected with their hosts, and being able to create this connection is absolutely vital for a podcast's long-term survival. Additionally, your host greatly affects the quality of your podcast. Their voice and speech patterns, vocal tics, interviewing skills, and ability to perform a script will all come out in the final product. So it's important to ensure that your host has what it takes to create the show that your brand deserves. With this in mind, we've compiled a list of important qualities to consider when you're choosing a host for your podcast. Some of these are skills, and they can be taught, and not all of them are required for every topic or every format. For example, having a host with great interviewing skills doesn't matter if you're never going to have guests on your show, right? But we do caution brands against hiring a host that doesn't have any of the qualities that we're about to talk about. So those qualities, and we're going to go into more detail in a minute here, are authenticity, enthusiasm, vocal control and training, performance and storytelling skills, interview skills, discipline, credibility and expertise, and an established audience. Authenticity is a huge must-have for a podcast host. Much like other highly visible positions, audiences respond better to hosts that they feel they can relate to. Podcasts rely on this quality more than other mediums because the listening experience is so intimate. When done correctly, podcasts feel like having a one-on-one conversation, and you generally don't want to be trapped in a long conversation with someone that you can't relate to or don't like, right? So choosing a host that has an innate capability to share their authentic personality and experiences through the audio medium can give your show a huge advantage in terms of longevity and audience engagement. Enthusiasm might seem like a silly thing to screen your potential hosts for, but it's one of the most important qualities that we're going to talk about. As Pacific Content's Dan Meisner so eloquently put in an article, the ideal podcast host has what he calls a spirit of partnership. They are genuinely interested in and dedicated to creating a dazzling, audience-driven show that's worthy of your brand and your customers. They can't just be a hired gun that shows up for a paycheck, and they can't begrudge your brand's involvement in any step of the podcasting process. The right host takes pride in their work and strives to create the best podcast possible. Vocal control and training is a skill that can be taught to some extent, but some people are definitely better than others when it comes to speaking into a microphone. Things such as the pitch and tone of your host's voice are important, as well as their natural speech patterns and pacing. You need someone who can be clearly understood while still being able to showcase their emotions in their voice. Being clear but monotone, or animated but difficult to understand, are both situations to avoid in podcasting. You also need to evaluate if your host has any bad habits, such as loud breathing, frequent mouth sounds, or vocal tics that your audience may find annoying. Surveys conducted on a variety of podcast audiences found that they will stop listening to programs that contain consistent noises that they find off-putting, such as licking one's lips or clearing one's throat. It's thought to be related to misophonia, which is sort of the frequent irritation by things like people chewing, these kind of natural sounds. While vocal control can be taught, and it's not necessary for your host to be perfect at all times, you don't want them coming out sounding like a robot, of course. You should take these things into consideration, especially if a host is really markedly affected by them. Like any actor, a podcast host needs to be able to lift your content off the page and bring it to life. Making a podcast isn't just about reading a script into a microphone. It's about having a conversation with your audience and presenting your content in an engaging, digestible way. The audio format of a podcast has a ton of narrative bandwidth, and a good podcast host needs to understand the art and craft of storytelling on a basic level to be successful. Topics like story structure, point of view, focus points, and more are all really important for formatting your content in a way that makes sense and feels natural for listeners. Hosts that have a proven track record with performance and storytelling are a huge asset in this sense. Journalists and writers make good candidates, but influencers who run successful YouTube channels or even who make TikToks that include a lot of talking could have a lot of potential as well. It's really about their ability to present information in engaging ways. While interview skills may not be necessary, if you're planning on a podcast format that's more internally focused, like a roundtable or a solo podcast, it's imperative for any podcast that plans on featuring guests. Interviewing isn't just asking questions. An interviewer is the proxy for the audience, and they need to be able to listen effectively, follow their curiosity, and be comfortable going off script to challenge guests when it's necessary. This will make your interviews come out a lot more natural and engaging, especially if the host is genuinely interested and excited about the topic at hand and the person they're sitting in front of. I specifically think of the Ologies podcast with Ali Ward as an example of this. Ali is incredibly excited about the people she meets and the things that she learns, and her excitement is infectious and reflected in her audience. Interviewing is another skill that can be taught, but it's a slow process for a lot of people, and many find that it has a really steep learning curve. It's a lot more beneficial to hire a host that already has experience with interviews, especially if you're working on a tight turnaround and you don't want someone who's going to learn on the job. Discipline is an important quality for your host to have simply because it makes your day-to-day management of creating your content a lot easier. You can't work with a host that is consistently late for recording sessions or that doesn't prepare for episodes beforehand. You need them to be fully on board with the preparation part of creating a podcast, or that lack of preparation is really going to come out in the quality of a finished product. Yet another important aspect of discipline for a podcast host is discipline in their conversations. In normal social situations, some people are drawn to rambling or going on off-topic tangents. This is a normal part of their personality, but it can make a podcast really difficult to listen to. While some formats, such as roundtable conversations, can benefit from some tangents, a show needs to be able to stay on topic most of the time to be successful in the long run. Keep an eye on the way that your potential hosts naturally engage in conversations while you're screening them. Some people can't help getting off topic and they don't even know that they're doing it, but you could definitely see it in their interactions. Apart from enthusiasm, credibility is the most important quality to screen for when you're choosing a podcast host. Choosing a host with established credibility and expertise in your chosen subject matter can greatly improve your podcast scripts, lines of questioning during interviews, and brand engagement. Having a well-known host can also make it much easier for you to book valuable guest experts earlier in your podcast's development, rather than having to sort of build your own credibility before you can book those big names. There is a caveat with an expert host, however. With some subject areas and show formats, it can actually be better to hire a host that has less experience, but more curiosity about what the guest has to say, especially in the case of shows that cover very niche and technical topics like science or industry. It helps to have a host that has a closer level of knowledge to the audience so they can act as a guide through what they're learning, rather than just sort of having two talking heads who don't understand like where a layman would be coming from. This quality goes hand in hand with a host's established audience. Having a potential audience that's already loyal to your host gives your show an immediate advantage. And this can be any type of audience, whether your chosen host has a large social media following, a flourishing YouTube channel, or a passionate fan base that they've gathered in another medium. They can all be leveraged to promote your podcast and build your audience from the beginning. Of course, the caveat for this requirement is that your host has to be willing and able to actually use their established channels to promote your content effectively and authentically. If a host never posts about your show, or worse, posts in a really lackluster, disengaged, or otherwise begrudging manner, then all of that effort screening them has been wasted. You need someone who's as excited about your show and willing to promote it as you are. Now that we've gone over what you need to be looking for, we're going to talk a little bit about the screening process that you can use to ensure that your host is the best for the job. This process will differ depending on the type of show you're creating and the people that you're considering for the job, but these tips are built to help you figure out which of the above characteristics your potential hosts have. So we always start with doing research at Influicity. This is where most hiring processes start, but it's worth mentioning in this process as well. Check your potential hosts out beforehand. Take a look at their social media presence, any content that they may already be publishing, and how they generally present themselves in the public eye. This is going to tell you a lot about how they're going to be as a podcast host. Pay attention to how their personality will match up with the kind of content you're going to create, how they typically interact with others, and what they're passionate about. You also want to be really careful that they don't actively oppose any of your brand's key values or mission statements. Interviewing is yet another standard for the hiring process, but it's especially important for a podcast host. It's not so much about the questions that you ask during the interview or the answers that they give you, but how your potential host is interacting with you. Are they confident? Can they improvise and tell personal anecdotes without dominating the conversation? How your potential host conducts themselves in an interview without any recording devices present is a great indicator of how they'll conduct themselves while interviewing a guest for your show. You obviously want to avoid candidates that consistently interrupt you or that tend to clam up. Any candidates that have qualities that might make them less well suited for a podcasting format. And of course, doing a test recording is very important. Put your potential host in front of the microphone and see how they'll sound. Give them a sample script to read, have a conversation with them while you're recording, and have them improvise a personal anecdote to see how they sound in different kinds of situations. Are they better with scripts or are they better going off the cuff? This will really give you valuable insight about how your show might come out if you choose this candidate as your host. In the end, the host for your podcast is the vehicle to get your content to your listeners. And you really need to be choosing someone who is the best candidate for the job. Whether you are starting a show about business or a fun fiction podcast. It doesn't really matter. The host is the main part of all of this, and they're the central kind of pivot around which the rest of your podcast is going to revolve.